Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back. We're going to start reading chapter 3 in Mary's Message to the World. And of course, that is written by Annie Kirkwood. And chapter 3, I think, is going to be quite an interesting chapter because Mary is going to tell us about her and Joseph's life together on earth. So we start out with just a little bit of information here at the top. And of course, yes, this chapter is as equally long as chapter 1. So I will be breaking this up into 2, maybe 3 videos. We'll see what we're looking at time-wise, okay? All right, so I'm going to open up with what the author is saying. While we were receiving Mary's messages, she made several references to how she felt at a particular time or what was happening around her. I found this very interesting and asked Mary if she would tell us more about herself, Joseph, her family, and what her life was like in those very important days of our Christian culture. The following was sent in answer to my request. It shows that Mary and Joseph were very human while on earth and had many of the same concerns as we do today. It also brings into play how they coped with the work of Jesus. They were very proud, yet felt very humbled by his life. It also tells how their love has expanded to include the whole world. I was quite young when the angel of the Lord came to me and told me I would be with child before I was with Joseph. For a while, I wondered if I had dreamed this, if it was real. The only person I felt that I could talk to about it was a distant relative named Elizabeth, who at the same time was with child. I had no idea she would be in this condition, for in our day, news of this kind was not brandished about. In fact, when a woman was pregnant, she hardly left her home at all. On my way to Elizabeth's home, I ran the whole scene with the angel over and over in my mind. Then I neared the village. A thought entered my mind which stopped me instantly. I had not had any trouble from my parents about this visit to see Elizabeth. There was not one word of protest. Each family member had his chores, so when one was away, the workload increased for all the family members. I concluded this must be the right thing to do at this time. Upon arriving at Elizabeth's door, she greeted me warmly and said some magical words which amazed me. She said, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy." Elizabeth and I spent a few days discussing the events which had happened to her and to me, and how blessed we both were. Elizabeth had much information to give me about how to depend on God during this great adventure. She said God would speak to Joseph and he would become my husband. Every detail would be worked out with God's help. In those days, I was a worrier, and I just knew that Joseph would not want me if he found out I was already with child. My worries continued. How could any man accept my story? It was unbelievable to me. How would I tell Joseph I simply was with child, yet I had not been with a man? Who would believe such a story? I continued to worry. I'm just going to move you back just a little bit. There we go. During those days, Elizabeth taught me to quiet my mind and allow the flow of God's Spirit to enter my being and answer all these questions. She also taught me how to keep quiet about things which were occurring in me and around me until such a time as God would reveal the story. Elizabeth became my best friend, and with much patience, she taught me how to care for an infant, how to seek and hear God's voice. As a young girl, I did not have this knowledge, but with her help, I soon learned much in the ways of women. The questions I could not ask my own mother, I could ask Elizabeth. The days during which I was in her home were a respite and a rest. All the ways in which I would need to depend and rely on God and on Joseph were instilled into my mind. Although I had always been very devout, very close to our Jewish heritage and religious customs, I learned the meaning behind many of these. I begin to see God not as someone way off who only spoke to our ancestors, but who could, in my day, talk to anyone. I am now sure that it was God who taught me through Elizabeth. Elizabeth and I truly have a bond even to this day, which is not surpassed by any love. Love bonds which you create on earth are very real and continue all your eternal life. Upon returning to my home and with advice from Elizabeth, I told my parents what had happened, beginning with the coming of the angel of the Lord and including all that had occurred during my visit with Elizabeth. We spent much time in prayer and fasting, as was the custom of our time. We went to the temple and said our prayers and made the appropriate sacrifices dictated by our religion. Then, with much compassion and love, my parents began to prepare me and themselves to lead this new and wonderful life which God had ordained. Joseph and I were married with never any thought except for the child that was growing inside of me. We spent hours talking about why God had chosen us for this. We were afraid at times, and at times we were very comfortable with the idea of the birth of his son to a virgin. It took much restraint for Joseph to put aside his needs in order to follow God's wishes. This was his sacrifice. We pored over all the teachings of the prophets to see what and how it had been predicted that the Messiah would come. But we were puzzled that it had been predicted to happen in the town of Bethlehem, when we knew no one in this community. We also could see no reason for going to this area. Many nights, Joseph and I would discuss whether we truly were the parents of the Messiah, or if this was an illusion or misconception on our part. As you see, we had very human doubts and questions. While preparing for the birth, Joseph began his business of carpentry, building furniture and items for others. This is how he earned his living. Then in the last months of pregnancy came the decree. Each family was to return to the town of its ancestors to register. Since we did not have mail or phone service as today, we physically had to go to be registered. At this time, we realized that we would be in the town of Bethlehem for Jesus' birth. We always called him by his name of Jesus, even before he was born. Since we really thought we would be returning to our home, we only took those items which we needed for this particular journey. We were very ignorant of how spirit works, but at the onset, we placed ourselves in God's hands and felt he would not let us down in any way. Joseph borrowed a donkey for me to ride to Bethlehem, but even that was not very comfortable. Being in the last month of pregnancy, I was very uncomfortable anyway. We took our time and did not try to keep the pace of the crowd with which we started out. There were in those days many people on the roads going back to their hometowns to register. Along the way, we met many wonderful people and were included in many family gatherings. At night, when we had to lay down along the road, it seemed miraculous that we would meet with a large family, where there was always plenty of food being prepared without my help. After riding all day on a donkey in this last stage of pregnancy, I did not feel like cooking a meal or cleaning up afterwards. All I wanted was to rest my weary body. Not only was food provided, but nice soft pelts and blankets on which to sleep. Every morning early when we arose, Joseph and I gave thanks to God. Throughout the day, we were constantly in an attitude of gratefulness for all the preparations which were made along the way. Finally, late one night, we arrived in Bethlehem. Since all had been so easy on the road, we thought God would have a nice, clean room prepared for us. Just got to move something out of the way here. When we were turned away from all the lodging places, we became desperate because I had begun the process of labor. Joseph, in his usual way, became riled and got angry with God for not providing us a nice, clean room as expected. Finally, he returned to one of the inns and told the innkeeper of our situation. This man was very sympathetic, but there was not one room to be had in all the town. People were staying and paying to sleep on roofs. Even in the cold night air, every available place was taken. We were told that had we arrived just a few hours earlier, we could have had a small corner of the kitchen, but not even that was available. But, he said, he did have a barn. There was no one in the barn except for a few animals. The barn was large, and we could make pallets with the hay and rest well. If we needed anything during the night, we could call on him and his wife would help him. We could call on him and his wife would help with the delivery of the child. Joseph asked only for a large pot to build a fire and plenty of water. This the innkeeper gladly provided and even helped Joseph prepare our resting places and our evening meal. He brought out some bread, cheese, and had some tea which his wife said would help with the pain of childbirth. She did not think I would deliver that night, and by morning they promised I would have a place inside their home. I ate a bite, drank the tea, and soon was overcome with the weariness of the journey. In the early morning hours, I awakened Joseph because I felt great pain and knew in my heart that Jesus would be born almost immediately, and he was. He came quickly and without much effort. Joseph cleaned us up, and we both prayed and thanked God. It was in that moment Joseph remembered the reason we were in this lowly place was for Jesus' birth. He remembered the words of the old prophets. The child Jesus was a beautiful child of light. Here was this newborn with his eyes opened wide. He had the most beautiful shining eyes I had ever seen. He seemed to comprehend what we said. Immediately he smiled and followed us with his eyes. He was a marvelous child. Jesus radiated light from inside. We recognized instantly that all our doubts of the past months were in vain. This truly was God's anointed child, the Counselor and Prince of Peace. Peace seemed to radiate from his face, and it was glorious. In our happiness, we decided to keep quiet about this event and spend the night in a warm feeling of divine love. In the first hours of sunlight, a few shepherds came to the barn to leave some sheep while they looked in the temple for the great birth. They said it had been given to them in a dream of the birth of a great king, and they wanted to visit him. We kept quiet and allowed them to see Jesus. Laughingly, we told them our son had been born on that very night also. They sat and talked with Joseph and were amazed that this was a newborn, because they felt he seemed to understand their words. Upon leaving, they told us that we had a very special child, for his face radiated light and knowledge. We did not reveal to them that they had indeed found the King of Kings. We were bound by God not to reveal this until the correct time. We spent a few days in Bethlehem. Because there was such a mob of people who had come to register, it took several days of waiting in lines. Joseph said we should wait until the lines were shorter before we went to register. In this way, I regained my strength and was able to feed Jesus and have him also gain his strength. He was such a happy baby from the beginning. It was as if he knew this was his childhood and he should enjoy every moment. Finally, the lines became shorter and we entered to register as ordered. We continued in the barn because many of the people had trouble registering, and it took many days for most of them. The congestion of people stayed the same, and we were quite comfortable staying in the barn. It was quiet and clean, whereas the inn was very noisy. There was much bickering among the children and mothers. The nights were noisy because of the babies crying and men snoring loudly. We were very happy in the barn and in the cocoon of quietness, which settled upon the barn every night at sunset. The innkeeper's wife would not hear of me traveling until after the 40 days, which I needed in order to be purified. This was ordered by the laws of Moses. We took the time because we felt that God had something else for us to do, and we did not have a clear idea of what it was. At the appropriate time of circumcision, we took the baby Jesus to the temple. Upon entering the temple grounds, there was an old man who quickly came to us and began to bless Jesus and to pronounce many marvelous words on him. We took this as God speaking to us through this man. As he spoke, there was an old woman who some said was a seer or prophetess, and she gave a life reading for Jesus, in which she foretold all the marvelous ways Jesus would help the whole world. and not only our people. After the ceremony, we returned quickly to the barn and talked about what had happened that day. Joseph was an impatient man and was ready to return to Nazareth to finish work that he had left incomplete. We talked and discussed how my time of purification was not over. But Joseph was in a hurry and said we would pray and ask God how long it would be before I could travel. It came to Joseph that night in a dream that the time was not yet, that one more thing of an unusual nature would happen before we could leave. Joseph, in his impatient manner, began to become angry and upset. I calmed him with words of wisdom, which I know came from God, for I could not believe I could speak in such a logical and understanding way. When Jesus was approximately 5 weeks old, the next unusual event occurred. As always, the ways of God were very mysterious. During one night, there came 3 great men on camels. They were magnificent and learned men, who also were looking for the king who had been born in Bethlehem. They fed their animals, sat a while, and rested as we gave them hot broth and bread. They began to speak of the purpose of their journey. We realized this was the event for which we had been waiting. I brought Jesus to them, and he awakened, and it was as if Jesus recognized them. They immediately knelt and praised God for giving truth and allowing them to be a part of this great happening. That night, they told us they had stopped first at the king's palace, looking for the newborn king. They related how there was indeed one star which seemed to guide them to Bethlehem and to this very barn. But, they warned, they had a bad feeling about Herod the king. They feared our lives were in danger. They wanted us to go with them to their home where we would be protected. Joseph said we would consider their kind offer and let them know in the morning. As there were now rooms in the inn, they slept inside the inn. During the night, as Joseph was in a deep sleep, God spoke to him in a dream and showed him the pyramids of Egypt and the Great Sea. He awakened me, and we hurriedly packed. We took our donkey, Jesus, our small possessions, and left without a word to anyone. On the road, we never told anyone who we were, and we used false names. We took care not to cause too much trouble or attract too much attention to ourselves. It was not done in fear, but in caution. There is a difference in living in caution and in living in fear and anxiety. Jesus was a perfect baby who slept most of the way. The rocking of the donkey was as a lullaby for him. The trip, surprisingly, was one of great joy. In every town, the way was opened for us by God. All our food and lodgings were prepared ahead of time, and it all went smoothly. In fact, it was as if we were on a pleasure trip. The journey was long but enjoyable. There was the sense of a great adventure beginning in our lives. We could not send word to our family or friends for fear that we would be found, but through mental telepathy, as it is called today, we notified our relatives. Believe it or not, that's how we all started out. We didn't speak, we spoke with our thoughts and our facial expressions and our hand gestures. So I absolutely feel like that's absolutely possible. I notified my mother and Joseph his mother. Soon we felt the peace in our hearts and knew that they understood we were alive and well. We lived on the outskirts of a large city of Egypt called Cairo. There it was easy to hide among the thousands of people. Joseph found work with a carpenter and was happy to be once again working with his beloved wood. How he enjoyed making things of wood. His furniture pieces were works of art, and he gave credit to the owner of the shop always, for he did not want to call attention to himself. We prayed daily, meditated every night, and sought God's counsel. Jesus grew into a lovely toddler and was very smart. He learned to walk early and to talk at a young age. Because he was very intelligent, we cautioned him only to speak to us in our home and not when we were in public, so as not to cause a commotion among the people. It was hard on Jesus, but it was as if he knew we were on a great adventure. We loved him so much. He was an easy child to love, for he was very demonstrative and loved to give kisses and hugs. He was a healthy child. Other mothers asked me, how did I keep him healthy, when all around us raged fevers and plagues, which affected most children? We simply said we were lucky to have had a healthy child. And speaking of child, my son is in the next room and he may get a little bit loud. I kept to our home and did not promote too many friendships, but this was hard on me. Joseph was out among people and had time to talk and to be with others. On the other hand, I was indoors, so Jesus and I became very close. I did, however, miss having friends my age. Still, I was quite young, and many of the other mothers were older and looked upon me as a youngster. I was told over and over during these years that I was a child playing at being a mother. We were in Egypt for 3 years, and in that time I taught Jesus the ways of our people. He learned the prayers and the reasons why we had our religious holidays. It was all low-key, for we were still in jeopardy. The house we lived in had a very small courtyard. It was here that, as Jesus and I played in the sun, I taught him of his people. I told him the stories of Abraham, Moses, and Joseph, who had also lived in Egypt. I would tell him of his home in Nazareth. He learned of his grandmother's and of his father's parentage, that he was a descendant of King David. This made him very proud, and he would play that he would someday free our people, like Moses, and lead them out of the wilderness, as did Abraham. These, then, were the lessons and the way in which I taught him. Remember that I was a very young girl of 16 earth years when Jesus was born. We became not only mother and son, but also friends. I would think 16 was pretty average to have babies back then, but I guess not. It was in Egypt that our family grew with the birth of James. He was not as quiet and congenial a child as Jesus had been, but he so loved Jesus, and it was Jesus who could sing to him, talk to him, and calm his temper tantrums. There were 2 years and 10 months differences in their age. It could have been more than that, for Jesus immediately became the big brother and took care of this younger brother, whom he loved. On the birth of James came the word that King Herod had died. Joseph, however, was cautious and waited until God gave him the word to leave Egypt and return to Nazareth with our family. When Jesus was 3 years and 7 months, we left Egypt and returned to Nazareth to our home. Upon arriving home, our family came to greet us and to inquire as to what and where we had been all these years. Imagine. The grandparents were thrilled with our children, and especially Jesus. Jesus was very much ahead of his years. He knew the stories of our religion and the words of our prophets, to the amazement of our family and friends. During the year after our return to Nazareth, Joseph's father took charge of Jesus. Grandfather taught him much of the writings of our religion, the whys and how comes we had feast days, how these observances were representations of events which had occurred to our people in the past. Jesus loved to listen and to question his grandfather. Soon grandfather was taking Jesus everywhere with him. Joseph and I talked to Jesus and told him he was not to show off his knowledge or call attention to himself. Jesus questioned this, and we explained that there was a great work for him to do later, but for now he was to keep quiet and learn all he could. In school, Jesus excelled and was soon passed on to upper classes of learning. He was an obedient child and simply showed his curiosity and inquisitiveness. Now, all this sounds like Jesus did not play and romp with his peers and brothers. That was not so. He was very much a boy and enjoyed running, skipping, and playing with the others into the twilight hours. As soon as the first star came out, Jesus was once again looking into the skies and wondering what this was all about. He questioned us about the skies and the stars. What were they made of? Why were they put there in that place? He was seeking answers to the same questions which some of the young have today. As our family grew, more and more children arrived. I had less and less time to spend with Jesus, but he was always near and seemed to understand. There were times when I would be sitting out in the yard preparing vegetables or meats for a meal, and Jesus would come and sit beside me. He asked again and again about his birth, about how the angel of God had spoken to me. We also talked much about our concept of God, what was written in our scrolls about God. He taught his younger brothers to be dependable and honest, as was Joseph. When he was 6 years old, Jesus began to work with Joseph in the carpenter's shop. At first, he cleaned and swept. Then he was given small jobs to do, sanding or learning to weave the seats and backs of chairs. Jesus quickly learned all lessons. His mind was like a sponge, and all knowledge was as water to be sopped up. Jesus loved Joseph and appreciated the love and camaraderie which existed between them. There was a special relationship between Joseph and Jesus, which is not noted in your Bible. At evening time, I could see them sitting in the early darkness, viewing the stars and talking of God. There was such a closeness that they were at times of one mind. Joseph and grandfather Josh, or Jacob, taught Jesus all they knew. He learned quickly what was available to him in our town. Allow me to describe Jesus as a child. He was thin but strong. He had much hair, and it was the color of chestnuts. Interesting. So when I think of a chestnut, I think of almost a light brown with a little bit of red. I don't think of dark black or dark brown like we traditionally see Jewish people. But way back then, many people were actually light-skinned and had light hair. That influence hadn't quite come to that area just yet, that dark skin, dark features. What we see today with Jewish people and people that are, Iranian or from Iraq, Persian, Indian, in that area where he lived, there were a lot of people who had red hair, light brown hair, auburn hair, even blue and green eyes. His light olive skin was tanned from being out in the sun. His eyes were very strange and at times were light green and other times seemed to be gray. I would describe his eyes as hazel now, but even that is not a good way to describe them. You knew what mood he was in by the color of his eyes. Although he seldom lost his temper, when he did, his eyes would become dark and menacing. Jesus played with his brothers and sisters. He made up games to entertain the children when it rained. His quick mind brought many new ideas, which his brothers and sisters also quickly learned. The children played tag, hide and seek, and tug of war. Played with a rope. Tug of war played with a rope. Jesus would spend hours working on toys for the girls and the younger ones. In the summer, they would chase butterflies, pick flowers, and play a type of ball game with a wooden ball that Joseph made for them. Jesus was very normal in every way, except for his exceptional mind. He could memorize the verses and Psalms in record time. He learned very quickly and was interested in riddles and rhymes. When Jesus was 12 years old, we took him to the temple. He could not believe the stories which were being told by the elders. He knew the stories were not quite being told correctly, so he began to correct the elders. He spoke with such authority that they were amazed. They asked Jesus questions, and he could answer them with verse and with reason. This was the first time Jesus had disobeyed Joseph and me. Joseph found him answering questions and brought him out into the courtyard of the temple to wait for me. As Joseph became engrossed in a conversation with other men, Jesus returned to the elders and once again questioned them. Joseph was quite upset with Jesus. We left immediately for home. We spent the whole night in prayer, asking God how to correct this child, how to reason with our young man who was approaching the age when the young rebelled against their parents. We were concerned that Jesus would begin to call attention to himself before his time was ready. That night in a dream, God spoke to Jesus and to Joseph with the same message. Both were told to find a school in a distant land. We were also instructed in giving Jesus as much schooling as we could. In our village, he had surpassed all the others and was becoming quite well known among many in the surrounding villages. Joseph and I knew of a school which was in a land between Nazareth and Egypt. It was a school which taught the spiritualness of all beings. Joseph took Jesus to this school in his 12th year. Okay, that's exactly half the chapter. So we're going to stop there and we will finish reading this wonderful, wonderful story that she is sharing with us. So we'll finish talking about their lives together, and then we're going to learn about Joseph's story. And let me see if that's, oh, and then also the assumption of Mary and other lives that they lived prior to being Joseph and Mary. Quite interesting. I'm so sorry my son is being a little bit loud. He's just having fun, and I hope it's not bothering you guys. Thank you all so very much for joining me. I'm really enjoying moving along in this book and learning all of these things and kind of deciding, what do I believe? What could be an influence from the channeler, from the person receiving the messages? What are things that are genuine? Those are things that you definitely need to think about when you're listening to stories and reading books and taking in information like this. But I'm really enjoying this. I hope that you guys are too. So we will finish the rest of chapter 3 in our next video. And until I see you, take care of yourself. Take care of those around you. I love you all very much. Bye-bye.